You never did anything for us. That sentence didn't come from a stranger. It came from my own daughter. The same girl whose tuition I paid 3 years in a row each time by pushing back my own life 1 inch at a time. The first time, it was the emergency fund. The second, the dental surgery I'd been postponing. But the last time, the one that really left a mark, I canceled the only vacation I had planned in 10 years. A trip I had been saving for quietly, secretly, like someone storing joy in jars. It was nothing extravagant. Just a small cabin by the water, books, silence, the kind of stillness you earn after decades of noise. I had even bought the hiking shoes, but then the tuition bill came. She called me crying, saying she was short, that financial aid didn't cover it, that if she missed this deadline, she'd lose the semester. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed with my unopened suitcase at my feet. I didn't even let her finish the sentence. I just said, "I'll take care of it," and I did. I moved the vacation money without a second thought, called the cabin, canceled the trip, unpacked the suitcase without making a sound. I told myself it was fine, that this was what mothers do, that one day she'd remember. But today, she stood in my kitchen, her voice sharp, her eyes colder than I remembered, and said it again, "You never did anything for us." And in that moment, something in me didn't just crack, it fell, quietly, like a shelf that had held too much for too long. I didn't respond right away. My hands were still wet from washing the dishes, and for a moment I just stood there, staring at the window above the sink. There was a bird outside, brown feathers. Nothing special, and yet it fluttered with a freedom I hadn't felt in years. I wiped my hands slowly. She was scrolling on her phone, barely glancing up, like her words hadn't landed like knives. Like she hadn't just erased a decade of sacrifices with one sentence. And the worst part? This wasn't the first time. I had noticed it for months, now this subtle revision of our story, how I was no longer part of her narrative, how I had been edited out. Family events I helped pay for that I was never credited in. Photos I took but was never in. And now, this. A total dismissal. You never did anything for us. I wanted to scream, to list it, all, every bill, every ride, every meal, every broken part of myself I had hidden so she wouldn't see how tired I was, but I didn't, because somewhere along the line I had learned that telling the truth always made me feel guilty. That defending myself sounded too close to begging. So I stayed silent, letting the moment pass, letting her keep scrolling. But inside, something shifted. I remembered the email confirmation of the tuition payment, the cancellation notice from the cabin, the hiking shoes still in their box, never worn. I wasn't imagining what I gave. I just hadn't asked for anyone to see it. And maybe that was my mistake. Because love, when done quietly, can look a lot like absence to people who were never paying attention. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling like it held answers. The sentence kept echoing. "You never did anything for us," over and over. And every time I heard it, I thought of something different. I gave up. I thought about the Sunday shifts I picked up to pay for her textbooks, the birthdays I skipped celebrating so she could have hers, the vacations I scrolled past online while making payment plans. I had always told myself it was temporary, that one day I'd get to breathe, that the season of sacrifice would pass and she'd see it, maybe even thank me. But here I was, older, heavier, lonelier than I'd ever been, and all I had to show for it was a sentence that erased me. I walked into the closet, found the hiking boots still sitting in their box, untouched, brand new. I sat on the floor and pulled them out, ran my fingers along the seams. They were beautiful, sturdy, waiting just like me. And for the first time I let myself feel it, not just the sadness but the resentment I had tried so hard to swallow. Not because I regretted loving her, but because I had done it in a way that required I disappear to make space for her comfort. I thought disappearing meant love, that silence meant strength, that selflessness meant devotion. But maybe, I had taught her that my needs didn't matter. Maybe I had modeled invisibility so well, she believed in it too. And maybe the first thing I needed to forgive wasn't her for forgetting. It was me, for never asking to be remembered. The next morning, I made coffee and didn't pour a second cup for anyone else. It felt strange, small, but intentional. I sat at the table with my own mug and didn't rush. I wasn't waiting for someone to wake up. I wasn't checking the time. I just sat there holding warmth in my hands, trying to remember the last time I did something without measuring its usefulness to someone else. The house was quiet, and in that stillness I finally heard myself breathe. I looked around the kitchen, clean, organized, full of little details I had kept up over the years. The stocked pantry, the polished silverware, the fridge that never ran empty. None of it ever posted, none of it ever praised. But it was all me. I remembered a quote I once read, Mothers are the invisible infrastructure of everyone else's dreams. At the time, I thought it was beautiful. Now, I wasn't so sure. Because being invisible, no matter how noble, starts to feel like fading. I opened a drawer where I kept receipts, and sure enough, there they were. The tuition payments, dates, amounts, my name, proof that I had, in fact, been there. Not that I needed proof, but still, something about holding it made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't about the money. It was about the memory of saying yes over and over, without ever asking myself what I was saying no to in return. I put the receipts in an envelope and wrote one word across the front: me. Because maybe that's who I had been missing all this time, not their version of me. Not the one I hoped they'd remember, but the one I kept abandoning while trying. To make their path easier, later that day I went out. Not for errands, not for groceries, just out. I walked through the neighborhood like I was visiting it for the first time, eyes wide, noticing things I used to pass without seeing. A new bakery, a park bench that caught the sun just right. I stopped by a small bookstore and let myself wander without purpose. It felt unfamiliar, to move without an agenda. I picked up a journal with a soft navy cover and blank pages that smelled like possibility. I bought it not because I needed another notebook, but because I needed a place to tell the truth, not the polished version. Not the story I fed others to prove I was okay, just the real, unfiltered truth. I came home, opened the journal, and on the first page I wrote, I mattered, even if no one said it. And suddenly, something loosened inside me like a knot I didn't know I'd been carrying. I thought about all the times I had been praised for being strong, reliable, always there. How I had worn those words like medals, when in reality, they were chains. Because strong often meant silent, and reliable often meant overlooked. I had become so good at showing up that no one questioned if I ever needed someone to show up for me. I looked around the house at the shoes by the door, the folded laundry, the quiet hum of a fridge I kept stocked. I whispered, this didn't happen by accident. And no, it wasn't about demanding gratitude. It was about recognizing that I had been a whole person this entire time, not just a background character in their success story. And from now on, I would stop editing myself. Out of the narrative that evening, she texted me. Not an apology, just a casual message asking if I could help her figure out paperwork for grad school. I stared at the screen for a long time, the words swimming under the glow of everything unspoken. I thought of how easy it had become for her to reach for me when she needed something, and how easy it had been for me to respond every time. Not out of obligation, but out of pattern. Because somewhere along the way, being needed had started to feel like love. I put the phone down. Without replying, not forever. Just not now. I needed space. Not to punish her. To hear myself think without her voice layered over mine, I sat on the couch and opened the Navy journal again. Wrote, you're allowed to pause. You're allowed to not jump every time someone calls your name. And I let that truth settle into my bones because I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired of being available at the cost of my own restoration. I was tired of being the solution, the fallback, the one who never had to be checked on because she was always fine. I wasn't. I had wanted that vacation for a reason. Not to escape, but to breathe. And maybe I had canceled the trip, but I didn't have to cancel myself anymore. I looked at the hiking boots still in the box, and for the first time, I didn't feel regret. I felt direction. They weren't a symbol of what I gave up. They were a reminder of what I still deserved. And I decided right there, the next time I took a trip, I wouldn't bring my silence with me. A few mornings later, I woke up and didn't rush to open my messages. No checking in, no silent scanning for who might need something. I made breakfast, slowly eggs toast. The kind of quiet that fills a room when no one is asking for anything. I sat at the table and without planning it, began writing again. But this time, it wasn't just reflection, it was intention. I listed the things I wanted, not for her, not for them, but for me. Peace, time, freedom from the guilt of always being the reliable one, and then something softer, beauty. I wanted beauty that didn't ask for justification. Candles I didn't have to save. Books I didn't have to lend. Walks I didn't have to explain. I got dressed and wore the perfume I usually saved for special occasions. This moment was enough. I passed by the hallway mirror, expecting to see the same tired woman, but something had changed. Her posture, her eyes, there was less weight on her shoulders, not because anything had been fixed, but because she had finally stopped carrying the need to be understood. I whispered, you don't owe anyone the rest of you, just because they never learned how to hold what you already gave. And it stayed with me all day. Through errands, through emails, through every little thing I did for myself without apology. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was finally listening to the woman I had silenced for years, the one who stood behind every sacrifice. The one who had waited quietly, patiently for a moment like this, not to be rescued, but to be chosen. And this time, I was the one doing the choosing. That afternoon, I walked past the travel agency I used to daydream in front of. The posters in the window hadn't changed much. Beaches, mountains, cabins by the lake. But this time, I didn't just look. I went inside. The woman behind the counter smiled gently and asked if I needed help. I said, "Not yet, but I will," and I meant it. I left with 3 brochures tucked into my bag, each one filled with places I used to believe were only possible once everyone else had what they needed. I went home and spread them out on the kitchen table like puzzle pieces to a life I had postponed long enough. Each photo reminded me of something I had once wanted: space, quiet, a window that overlooked something other than duty. And in that moment, I wasn't thinking about who would need me while I was away. I wasn't planning around someone else's emergencies. I was dreaming out loud, and it felt radical, freeing. I opened the journal and wrote at the top of the page, "This time, I leave with both hands. Not half empty, not scraped thin, not apologizing. Just gone for myself." And when she texted again that evening, asking about forms and deadlines, I didn't feel the usual pull. I responded kindly, briefly, and then I turned the phone face down and returned to the brochures, because I was done proving myself to people who only measured love by what it fixed. I wasn't her emergency contact anymore. I was my own. And while that might not show up in anyone else's version of the story, it would live in mine loudly, clearly, like footsteps on a trail I finally decided to follow. That night, I took the hiking boots out of the closet again, the ones I never wore. I placed them on the floor beside my bed, not as guilt, not as memory, but as possibility. I sat beside them, running my fingers along the laces like a ritual. They were still, perfect, still waiting. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation for why I had kept them. I didn't need them to mean anything more than this. I had once planned something for myself, and now I would again. I folded the brochures and slid them into a drawer not hidden, just resting. I'd book the trip soon, maybe alone, maybe not. That part didn't matter yet. What mattered was that I was no longer putting my life on hold in the name of being someone else's safety net. I stood in the kitchen and looked around, not at what was missing, but at what had remained me, my voice, my softness, my strength. I whispered aloud, "You were always here," and the room held that truth like an old friend. Not every sacrifice has to be shouted to be real, but I had shouted it in other ways, through late-night payments, silent meals, canceled plans, and I was tired. Not of loving, but of loving without being seen. So I made myself one final vow. You are not the lesson someone learns too late. You are the person who learns on time. And with that, I turned off the lights, slipped into bed, and rested. Not because the weight had vanished, but because I had finally stopped confusing invisibility with devotion. And tomorrow, I would wake up as someone who remembers herself first. A few days later, I ran into a neighbor at the grocery store, an older woman I'd helped once when her electricity went out. She remembered, she smiled warmly, placed her hand on mine, and said, "You always show up for people." And something about the way she said it, soft, unforced, with no agenda, it my chest ache in the gentlest way. I thanked her, walked home with tears caught in the corners of my eyes. That sentence shouldn't have meant so much, but it did. Not because I needed the praise, but because it reminded me that being seen doesn't require grand gestures. It just takes someone who's paying attention. I sat on my porch for a while that evening, letting the breeze wrap around me like a memory. I thought about all the times I had shown up, not just for family but for strangers, friends, even people who forgot me the moment they got what they needed. And I realized something they may have forgotten, but I didn't. I remember every sacrifice, every quiet act of love, every time I chose them over myself. And now, I was choosing to remember me too. Because just as I've been the witness to their growth, I could be the witness to my own. I didn't need a thank you post. I didn't need a public confession. I needed space to rebuild, to forgive, to unlearn the habit of making myself small so others could feel tall. And in that moment of stillness, I felt something returned, a sense of justice, but of peace. Because finally, I understood, being forgotten by someone else doesn't mean you have to forget yourself. That weekend, I opened the old photo album, the one I used to keep in the back of my closet. Not the digital kind, the real one, with taped corners and faded edges. Inside were snapshots of moments I had forgotten to remember. Her first day of school, birthday cakes I stayed up all night baking, notes I left in lunchboxes, and one picture of me smiling beside her at her graduation, my arm around her shoulder. She had cropped it on social media, of course, but here in this page I was still there, still smiling, still showing up. And something about seeing that photo, the full one, made me realize I didn't need edits or applause to prove I had been present. I closed the album gently and whispered, I was always part of the picture, even when they tried to crop me. Out, I went to the drawer and pulled out the hiking boots again. Set them beside the door, not for decoration, for use. I circled a weekend on the calendar, wrote my time in bold letters, no one else's name. No compromise. That night she texted again, another request, this time about helping with paperwork for a job application. And I replied, I know you'll figure it out. Nothing harsh, nothing bitter, just trust. Not in her and me, that I didn't need to be needed to matter. That I didn't have to stretch myself thin to remain in someone's story, because my presence didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be whole. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not demanding a new role in someone else's life, but finally claiming the lead in your own. On Sunday morning, I packed a small bag, just enough for a few days, comfortable clothes, a book I never finished, the Navy journal, and the boots. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't leave a note explaining where I was. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to justify taking up space. I drove with the windows down, letting the wind tangle my hair and silence the inner voice that always asked, but what if they need you? This time the answer was simple. They'll figure it out. The cabin was quiet, simple, a small porch, trees whispering just outside the window, and the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels earned. I made tea, sat with my feet up, no schedule, no requests, just me, in the life I had delayed for years. I opened the journal and wrote a single sentence. I am allowed to arrive where I belong, if no one claps when I get there, and I let the stillness hold that sentence for me. I thought of all the times I wanted someone to say thank you, to see me, to validate that the things I did in the shadows were still real. But now, I didn't need the echo. I had my own voice, and it was enough. I looked out at the trees and smiled, not because everything had been fixed, but because something inside me had finally shifted. I had left the door open for their validation. For so long now, I was closing it gently, with love, and stepping fully into the space I had built with my own hands. Not for them, for me, at last. When I returned home, everything was as I'd left it. The lights still worked. The house was still standing. Nothing had collapsed without me, and somehow that brought more comfort than sadness. I unpacked slowly, placing the boots beside the door instead of hiding them again. They had touched dirt, now real trails, not imagined ones, and that made them feel like witnesses to a new version of me. I brewed tea and sat by the window, letting the quiet fold over me like a familiar blanket. I didn't rush to check messages. I didn't brace for requests. I just existed, fully, gently present. Later that evening, she called. Her voice sounded casual, like nothing had happened. She talked about school, work, small annoyances. I listened. I didn't bring up the vacation I had canceled years ago. I didn't remind her of the tuition. I didn't ask for anything. But when she paused and said, I know I've been a little distant, I smiled to myself. That was all I needed. Not an apology. Not a breakdown. Just a crack in the silence. I said, it's okay. I'm learning how to be closer to myself. These days anyway. She went quiet for a moment, then changed the subject. And that was fine, because I wasn't holding my breath for her to get it. I had already exhaled. And in that space, where I once waited to be seen, I had planted something better. Peace. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like roots under a tree that no one notices until one day they realize that everything strong starts quietly. And I had finally become the ground beneath my own feet. The next day, I printed a photo of the cabin, the lake in the background, my boots by the fire, a cup of tea on the windowsill. I framed it and placed it on the wall where a family portrait used to hang, not out of bitterness, out of balance. I stood in front of the photo for a while, letting it remind me that even if no one else remembers what I gave, I do, and that is enough. I opened the journal again, flipped to the first page where I had once written, I mattered, even if no one said it. And this time, beneath it, I wrote, and now, I say it for myself. I didn't need the old vacation. I didn't need the overdue thank you. I needed a life that didn't wait for someone else's permission to begin. I went to the closet and took out the envelope, the one with the tuition receipts I had labeled me. I read through them once more. Then I tucked them into the back of the journal. Not out of shame, but as a reminder, I did show up. I did give. I did love fully and without condition. And now, I choose to give some of that love back to the one person who had gone unnoticed for too long, me. Not for what I can provide, not for what I can sacrifice, but simply for being the woman who kept showing up, even when no one clapped, even when no one remembered. And now, she's finally remembering herself. That evening, I made dinner, nothing fancy, just something I liked. I set the table for one, lit a small candle, and played music that reminded me of who I used to be before life asked me to be everything for everyone. And I didn't feel lonely. I felt chosen by me. For once, I wasn't the background. I was the moment. And there was something powerful in that. I didn't need anyone to walk in and notice. I didn't need a witness. I had finally stopped measuring my worth by who clapped. I had become the applause, quiet, steady mine. Later, I stood by the window with the lights off, watching the street. Lamps flickered to life. People walked by, talking, laughing, hurrying through their evening plans. And I stood still, no longer rushing to catch up, no longer aching to be acknowledged. I whispered one last truth to the glass. I gave more than they'll ever know, but I'm not waiting for them to find out. Because this peace, this breath, this space wasn't built on their recognition. It was built on my refusal. To keep disappearing, the woman who paid the tuition, the woman who canceled the vacation, the woman who stayed quiet while everyone else took up space, she's not lost. She's just begun. And from now on, her love includes herself. So the next time someone says you never did anything, I won't flinch. I'll smile because I know what I did. And maybe that's all I ever needed. And you? Have you ever loved so quietly that they forgot you were there?